Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of the 60s in Vietnam. Our questions to think about here: how did Lyndon Johnson's Great Society represent an extension of progressivism? How did the Warren Court protect the rights of the accused? And how did the Warren Court protect civil liberties? So taking a look at the new president, Lyndon Johnson, he's a very stark contrast to John Kennedy. He has tons of experience, which is part of the reason why he was chosen as Kennedy's running mate in 1960. He had served as a senator from Texas, and he had the experience and the legislative savvy that Kennedy lacked. One of the things that we mentioned before with the civil rights movement is that personally, John Kennedy supported the civil rights movement, but because he didn't have broad political support, he really couldn't publicly support that. Lyndon Johnson is going to have that support going forward, and he has concerns about Americans living in poverty, civil rights, and education. Lyndon Johnson is going to call his domestic program the Great Society. And really, this is sort of his grand vision of reform, what he calls bringing abundance and liberty for all. And what we see about the Great Society is that this is very much building on the progressive tradition. So whether it was the progressive movement of the early 20th century or even building on FDR's New Deal, this is a grand program. It has numerous moving parts. I mean, whether it's funding, the creation and funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, or environmental programs or civil rights programs or anti-poverty programs. Lyndon Johnson really wants to make America a great society. As he put it, quote, "This country is rich enough to do anything it has the guts to do, and the vision to do, and the will to do." And so this is a dramatic expansion of federal social welfare programs. A couple of noteworthy items here, and keep in mind, this is just a very slim list of what the Great Society encompassed. But we establish Medicare and Medicaid. So making sure low-income families have access to health insurance and health care, that's Medicaid. And then for the elderly, that's Medicare. Head Start is government-funded preschool. Lyndon Johnson's very first job as an adult was teaching public school down in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. And what he saw firsthand is that education is one of those things that makes a huge difference in a child's life and in their entire life. But the problem is that middle class and wealthy people can afford to send their children to preschool. Low-income families can't. So this was a way, Head Start was a way of leveling that playing field. Side note, Lyndon Johnson wins the 1964 presidential election by really a lot. Take a look at the top pie graph there. Lyndon Johnson wins the vast majority of the Electoral College vote. Some of this has to do with his promotion of the ideas of the Great Society, but a lot of it has to do with a little bit of held over nostalgia for John Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson, like many vice presidents who became the president, played this brilliantly, sort of building on the national sense of mourning that, we're going to do a lot of this in the name of the dead president. One other thing to note, and we're going to come back to this, is that with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we start to see a political shift that's going to be really important. And it has to do with the solid South. So we talked before, ever since, Andrew Jackson, the Southern states have voted Democratic. But when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Southern states flip. And this was something that Lyndon Johnson anticipated. In fact, when he signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, he said, "I have effectively turned over the South to the Republican Party for the foreseeable future." And he wasn't wrong. Shifting gears here a little bit, I want to mention what's going on here with the United States Supreme Court. We've already mentioned that Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court during this time, but during this time, the Supreme Court was incredibly active in a variety of ways, and one of those ways was protecting the rights of people who are accused of a crime. And so we don't often think about the ways that the Constitution protects bad people or people who have done bad things, but it's one of the legacies of the Constitution that if you are accused of a crime, that you are innocent until proven guilty. And the Supreme Court during this moment in time is trying to make sure that that statement is still factual. So in 1963, the Supreme Court makes a decision in the case of Gideon versus Wainwright, which basically says that if you cannot afford a lawyer, that you must be provided with one, that a right to counsel is a constitutional right. In 1964, in the case of Escobedo versus Illinois, the Supreme Court says that you have a right to have your lawyer present during questioning. So what has come up is you've been taken into custody by the police and they start to interrogate you. And you ask for your lawyer and they don't allow one to be brought in. That's what essentially happens here in the Escobedo case. So the Supreme Court rules that you have the right to have your lawyer present once you're being interrogated or questioned by the police. In the case of Miranda versus Arizona in 1966, this is something that most people are at least vaguely familiar with. We've seen enough cop shows to have an understanding of your Miranda rights or the Miranda warning. But in this case, Ernesto Miranda was arrested for kidnapping and rape. And during a lengthy interrogation, he signs a confession. And he essentially sort of tells everything. And what his lawyers are going to argue on appeal is that at no point was Ernesto Miranda informed that he could simply remain silent. And so when this case is argued in front of the Supreme Court agrees that you must be informed of your rights, including the right to remain silent at the time of your arrest. So this requires that your Miranda rights or your Miranda warning be given at the time that you are arrested. Taking a look at another category of Warren Court decisions, we see an emphasis on protecting individuals' civil rights. We've already mentioned the case of Griswold versus Connecticut, 1965, when we were talking about the Roe versus Wade case. But to dig a little deeper into this case, the Supreme Court is going to overturn a state law that prohibits the use of contraceptives or birth control. And what the Supreme Court decided in that case is that within a married couple, any discussion about birth control or contraceptives is really a private conversation, and that if you look into the Constitution, it seems to imply a right to privacy. And that, of course, is going to lead to building on other decisions later on. But then we also have what I consider to be the best named Supreme Court decision of all time, Loving versus Virginia, 1967. The couple pictured here are Richard and Mildred Loving. They were an interracial couple living in Virginia, but they wanted to get married. The state of Virginia had banned interracial marriage actually since colonial times. So for well over 300 years, interracial marriage had been illegal in Virginia. And the map shows it was legal in many other states as well. So Richard and Mildred move to Washington, D.C., and they get married there. When they're ready to start a family, they want to be close to their own families. So they move back to Virginia, and then they're arrested. They're sentenced to 5 years in prison for marrying someone of a different race. And of course, their case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, and it overturns the state laws, which means that all of those states banning interracial marriage are having their laws overturned. So coming back to our questions to think about, how did Lyndon Johnson's Great Society represent an extension of progressivism? There's a very clear lineage between the progressives of the early 20th century and the kinds of reforms that they were putting in place. We add to that with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society is very clearly connected to that storyline. And then how did the Warren Court protect the rights of the accused, whether it was ensuring that you had access to counsel, that you had your lawyer present during questioning, or that you were informed of your rights at the time of your arrest, that you are having your constitutional rights protected. And then how did the Warren Court protect civil liberties? With the Griswold case, we are protecting a right to privacy implied by the Constitution. And with the case of Loving versus Virginia, we are allowing equal access to marriage for all. So stay tuned for part 3 of the 60s and Vietnam.